All right.
We had a really good time on top of that mountain. We had lunch in their restaurant there on the top. And anyway, then we descended down and found out they had a hot spring about 20 miles from there. And we hit every hot spring we could find to go in and take a swim in a hot spring. So we went over to the hot spring. And on the way, we looked up on the side of one of the steep mountains and come right down to the edge of the road. And there were some of the white doll sheep up there on the hillside. And there was one mother had a little kid, about, I guess it'd be about a foot tall. And it had somehow got separated from her and was down below, about 50 to maybe between 50 and 100 feet below her on that hillside. And he was started to bleat and make a lot of noise. And I don't know how that mother ever got down to him, but she jumped from one place to another and was right down there with that kid, and then took him with her climbed back up on the hill. And to watch that little thing jump around on those rocks was amazing, that they can have the footing and all that they do. But there was a herd of those. There must have been 20 of them up on that hillside. But that was the only little one that I saw. But there was wildlife everywhere there. When we left that spot and went down another 2 or 3 miles, there were some of the biggest elk I've ever seen standing right on the side of the road. Actually, on the shoulder of the road, one of them was. The rest of them were off maybe 30 feet off the edge of the road in that tall grass feeding. And I guess they're there all the time because people said they saw them. You could see them there anytime you drove down the road. So we went, after that, went down to the junction and then turned up the canyon to that hot spring. And when I parked the car in the pickup in the hot spring, there were mountain sheep all over the parking lot. There must have been 50 of them in that parking lot. And they just wandered around among the cars, and then they'd go back up on the hillside or else on the lawn and eat. So they were everywhere. There was a lot of them. But that was one of the nicest hot springs we found. They had a real hot pool, a medium pool, and then a cold water pool. So you could take your pick, and so we'd take a hot one and then get in the cool one and then get back in the hot one. We had a real good time there. And from there we went on up through into British Columbia, all the way up through to Dawson Creek, where the Alcan Highway started. And we have pictures standing at the monument there at the beginning of the Alcan Highway. And we followed it up to Alaska, and on the way we stopped at Watson Lake, and they have, and I don't know what they call it, but you can take your name sign and put with the rest of them, and there's thousands of them that there. You could take a stake and drive in the ground and nail your sign to it or hang it wherever you could find a place. But we didn't know that, so we didn't take a sign, so our name isn't hanging there. So we got to go back and get one hanging there. But we really enjoyed our trip to Alaska. We went on up. When they had the gold rush up there, now they went to Dawson City, which is on the Yukon River. And that's where the main gold strike was. And they went from Skagway and climbed up over that mountain, and most of you have seen the pictures of them climbing up over there. It said on one sign there in Skagway that there were enough horses that died on that hillside that you could walk up without stepping on anything but dead horses. That was a man killer and a horse killer to get up over that mountain. But so we drove from, anyway, we drove down to Skagway and then went back up to into the Yukon Territory, and then went on up to Dawson City itself. And it's a historic place. We spent a day there, then we crossed the river on a little ferry and went up what they call the top of the world highway. And it was on top of the world. Ruth could look out her window and see down 2,000 or 3,000 feet, and I could look out my window on the other side of that ridge and see down that far. And there was enough room to pass another car on that road, but that was all. And some places you would have to pull off and let the other car by. The road was dirt and it was raining lightly, so that the road was slick. So we had to be very careful when driving along that ridge. That first step would have been a bad one. So we went along that, and it was a beautiful drive. There's no homes or anything on that whole distance that I know of, other than right at the Alaska border. We were in the Yukon Territory, and then we went into Alaska. And it was tundra all over there. And I told Ruth that we ought to see caribou on that kind of a place. And just in a minute or two, 4 great big bull caribou come up off the side of the road, crossed the road and went up on a bank and then stood up there while we took pictures of them. So we really were impressed with how beautiful those big animals were. But we crossed the border there and went on down into Alaska, and we finally hit oil after we'd gone about 150 miles, and then the road was a little easier and better, and we were down off that ridge. So we got into Fairbanks the next day. We stayed overnight in between there, but in Fairbanks, Kent Everett lives in Fairbanks, and he's a cousin of Fred Broadbent, and lived a neighbor on the same block we were on in Hebert. So I knew him there. So, and they had a trailer park, so we stayed at their trailer park pretty near a week, waiting for Fred Broadbent and his wife Carol to meet us there. So they finally showed up, and we did the museum and the Indian arts place and a few things around Fairbanks. And then we headed down to Denali National Park, where Mount Whitney, Mount McKinley is. And Ruth and I got there a day ahead of them, so we went in the park, saw a grizzly bear and caribou, and we watched a fox stalk and hunt ptarmigan birds, and that was an exciting thing to watch. And we didn't see Mount McKinley. It was clouded in and we couldn't see it, but we hiked in the park and enjoyed that. From there we went on down to Homer, where we were going to go deep sea fishing. And we fished. You got it still going?
Yep.
We went fishing on a little, I guess it was a little,
Get me the remote.
a little boat, and it was probably 24 or 30 foot long, but it was a metal boat. And going across the waves, it made a horrible crashing noise every wave we hit. But when we got on the boat, the skipper wasn't on it, but he had some of the craziest music going on a recording thing there. And I said, I'm not going with him if he's going to play that kind of music. And Ruth, when he showed up, he was just a kid. And Ruth says, I'm not going with a kid out on that ocean. So we sat there and talked about it a while. Fred and brother Carol were there, and then we had another couple of Eskimo couple. So there was 6 of us on the boat. Well, we decided to go ahead and go on it. And as we went out onto the rougher water, one of the windows fell out, and the crashing noise just was exciting, I guess you'd call it. But anyway, then the skipper got on the radio and talked to another boat, and they had exchanged tapes for their recorder. So they talked back and forth and then decided they'd get together and interchange them again. So right out on that rough ocean, here these 2 boats are side by side running along full speed, throwing tapes back and forth. And the skipper was out on the deck doing that while the boat was running itself. So we were a little bit excited on that one. But that kid knew where to go fishing.
We're going to get Ruth in. There we go. Yeah.
No, I don't.
You don't want to be in the picture? Sit back and relax.
Sit back.
If you don't want to be in it, I can move it over, but sit back and relax so you're comfortable.
Okay.
There you go.
Anyway, we got out to where he was going to fish, and he threw his anchor out. And we looked out in a few minutes, and here was a whale surfacing off to the left of the boat about 50 to 100 feet away. And then he dived down. And Ruth tells this better than I do, but anyway, that skipper grabbed his knife and grabbed a hold of the anchor rope. And Ruth asked him, what are you going to do? And he says, well, that whale catches into my rope, I'm going to cut the anchor. And she says, well, what do we do without an anchor? He says, if I don't cut it, what do we do without a boat? But that whale surfaced again on the other side of the boat and played around there, so we got to watch him for a while. And that was exciting. But anyway, the skipper hooked up baited Ruth's hook. She threw it over the side, and there was a 2-pound lead weight on there to take it down. So she let it down, and before he got the second hook baited, she was hollering she had one on. And so she tried to get him to help her wheel it up. And he says, you paid the fish, now you go ahead and wheel it in. So she worked and worked, and she finally got it up where he could gaff it and throw it on the deck. And the interesting thing to watch him do that, he gaffed it, threw it on the deck, and then jumped on a straddle of it with a ball bat and beat it over the head till he had it quieted, and now I guess he killed it that way. And then he shoved it in a bin after he marked it, so Ruth had number 1 mark on her fish, and he marked mine number 2, and Fred's 3, and Carol's 4, and so on. So as we'd catch one, he'd do that and then put them in that storage bin where it was iced up to keep them fresh. So we caught our limit within, an hour or so. We had our limit. And he said, well, he had a license to catch a cod. Did we want a codfish? And boy, all of us wanted one. So we went over closer to the islands. We were out in the straits there they called them the Barren Islands, and there was nothing on them but wild birds and things. He went up close to that island and hooked codfish, and he fought it for just a few seconds, and that thing broke his line and all, took off. So he did it again and hooked another one and it broke his line. And he said, well, that's costing me $20 for each hookup. He said, I gotta quit. So we didn't get a cod, but we got a lot of halibut. We took them back to the dock where the boat went out of, and they had a fellow there that filleted those halibut for us. And we had left Bo in the trailer for 12 hours. So while Ruth watched him, I went to get Bo. But she watched him fillet that fish out. And then they took it from there over to the quick dry freeze place and cut it up into any way you wanted it. So we had that fish caught by 2 in the afternoon. By 4 o'clock, we had it over there getting it quick frozen. They took it to the airport for us, and Janice had it in Salt Lake the next morning. And it was still frozen just as hard as it was. They put it on dry ice and shipped it. So we shipped home, how many pounds, Ruth?
About 274 pounds.
Yeah, so we sent a lot of halibut home. And that was a real enjoyable trip. So we had a great time on that one. And then Fred and Carol left us the next morning and headed for home. They were only going to be gone 3 weeks and we were gone 3 months. So we had a great trip there.
What was the guy's name? I think his name was Chad.
Yeah, Chad, wasn't it? That's right.
The boat guy? Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, we felt like when we got back, if we went again, we'd ask for him because he did just a fantastic job for us. We had an enjoyable trip on that. Then on the way home, we came back through Prince George, then on down to Washington State, came in and down through Seattle, and we stayed in Bellingham, Washington, was it?
Did you tell her about the Prince Rupert trip?
Oh, no. On the way back from Anchorage, in Anchorage, we visited with a friend of Ruth's that had moved up there from Idaho. And we stayed there and went to church with him and everything. But anyway, then on our way home, Carol and Dan in their boat had come up from San Diego, and we met them in Prince Rupert. And Dan said, well, we'll take you out for a ride in the boat, because we had never been on it. We got out in the ocean of, I don't know, a few miles, and he says, we're going on up to Ketchikan. Why don't you just come and go, and we'll all go up to Ketchikan, and then you can catch the ferry back. So we did. We stayed overnight on the boat, and then went out to dinner and everything there in Ketchikan and toured it and watched the salmon come up the river, and had a really good time there. But what amazed me, Dan had never been in those waters, and on that boat, he had instruments enough that he put a disc in the computer showing where he wanted to go, and on the screen it would show, and his boat was automatic enough that he could set the pilot and it would follow that disc. And when we got close to Ketchikan, he put another disc in it, and it showed him the harbor and the whole thing. And so he could follow that thing and go right into a dock and come into the slit that he wanted to be in. So that amazed me to watch that process. So that boat he had was a really well-equipped boat. It had 2 big diesels to run the power, and then he had another big diesel to run the electricity. So, and he had enough gas or diesel on that boat to run, what did he say, 600 miles or something? Anyway, a long ways. So it was a nice boat. But anyway, we caught the ferry back, And that was a good experience for us because we decided we did not want to go on one of their cruises up through the inner islands anyway. But we got back to Prince Rupert and then went on down into Washington, and we stayed in a campground there in Washington, and I had a spring break on the trailer. A hanger, not the spring, but the hanger. And so I had to find a place to get it fixed. So I got on the phone and found a place to fix it the next morning, and we were there at 7 o'clock. So we decided we'd cruise and go down to the farmer's market there in Seattle. And as we left the campground and went out to the gate, we looked up across the freeway, and there was our temple. So we drove across there and went cruising around the temple for a while, and then went down to the farmer's market and bought what we wanted there. And then we went the next morning, got the spring fixed, and then headed down, so that we went down to the Oregon line anyway, crossed over the river, Columbia River, into Oregon, and then went over to the coast, went on down the coast to Melissa's and spent a couple of days there with them in, I can't think of the name of the town, but anyway.
Cranberry Town.
Yeah, they were raising cranberries there, and so we got to see the farm and all that. And Melissa took us tour in the lighthouses and things with the kids. So, and then we went crab fishing, and we caught, I don't know, hundreds of crabs, but not one of them big enough to keep. So we had a fun there with the kids. Then we went down into the redwoods, and we stayed in campgrounds along the ocean there, and we really loved that Oregon coast, and even the northern California coast. When we got into California, we stayed at just above Eureka anyway, and we drove over to the ocean and hiked out on the beach and had a good time there. We toured into the redwoods and hiked, and well, we went on several hikes in the redwoods, back in the deep woods. Really enjoyed that. Then we went from there over to Redding, California. From Redding we went over to just above Reno, stayed overnight, and then we went through Reno and down to Beatty, Nevada, and stayed overnight. And then from Beatty we drove through Vegas and then to our home here in St. George. So
I have to make a comment to get you into the next segment. We were over the California line from Oregon when he said, we're on our way home, and he said, you know, I've always wanted to see Nova Scotia. Now we're on the far west coast, and he's talking about seeing a far east coast, and I'm saying, okay, if we're going to Nova Scotia, we're going there on a mission. Because I couldn't see myself taking another trip that was for just fun and games. So anyway, that's what gets me to the mission.
And her prediction came true.
The Lord heard it.
We'll cover that next. Okay.
But can you believe after
Ruth and I got back from our trip to Alaska, she mentioned on the way back, I thought, boy, I'd love to see Nova Scotia. We hadn't gotten home yet from the trip we were on. She said, well, if we go again, we're going to go on a mission, not just to go as tourists. So we talked about it, and I was scared to death. So. But anyway, we talked about it, and well, we're past the age. 70 was the cutoff, and at that time I was 73, so I didn't think they'd take us. So I thought, well, let's just go ahead and talk to the stake president and the bishop and see what they think we should do. So we went to see the bishop, and he said, referred us to the stake president. So we went to see him. Told him we were probably too old, but if we could, we'd like to go on a mission to Nova Scotia. And he said, well, as far as age is concerned, you're a vibrant couple and you can certainly make it through a mission. He says, I don't know about Nova Scotia, but I'll put it on your application to the church and see what they come up with. So we signed it up and sent it off. And
I said if on the application I wrote, if the Lord needs us in Nova Scotia, if the saints need us in Nova Scotia, we would love to go there.
so we then decided to go on a trip. We drove down to Texas to Lynn's. Ruth stayed with Lynn, and I flew down to Florida to see Gail and the family. So this had been probably a month and a half after we sent the application in. And so we had one of our granddaughters that was here in St. George going to school check our mail every day to see if we had a letter from the church. And as we got back I got back from Florida, and then Ruth and I got in the car and headed for Nancy's in Mesa. And on the way, we phoned Sherston to see if our letter had come. And she said it had. And I said, well, just forward it on an overnight to Nancy's. Actually, I guess to the general delivery in Mesa. So she did. When we got into Mesa, we drove to the post office, and it was there. So we got it and took it out and sat in the car and decided we
drove to the temple.
Hmm?
We drove to the temple and opened it.
Oh, I'd forgotten that. We drove to the temple and sat there and opened it. And we decided at one point, I thought, well, let's don't even open it. But anyway, we went to the temple grounds and opened it. And lo and behold, it was the Canadian Halifax Mission, which is in Nova Scotia. So we thought, well, that's great. We made it to there. And the mission president, President Blake, called several times and talked to us, tried to decide where to send us.
After we got home, he called.
Yeah, after we got home and was here a day or two, he called. And we got all the information on Atlantic Canada, which covered all that area that Nova Scotia Mission covered. And it covered out Prince Edward Island, and Newfoundland, which were islands out in the ocean, and Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and part of Maine.
Labrador.
And Labrador. And so we studied that map and figured out where he'd send us. And we worked every place we could to decide. And at some point in there, Ruth says, well, no, Newfoundland is the farthest point away from the mission, so that's probably where they'll send us. Oh, they'll never send us out on an island 150 miles out in the ocean. But when did we know before we left here where we were going?
Yeah, because President Blake called, when he called once, he told us that we would meet him there, but then we would would be in Corner Brook and Deer Lake. And
Yeah, that's, so when he called, he told us we were gonna go to Nova Scotia, Newfoundland. At the point we left here, we weren't going to Newfoundland, we were going to Newfoundland. But we quickly learned that if you said that word there, they corrected you. It was not Newfoundland, it was Newfoundland.
in Canada, all the accent is on the last syllable. So when you say Canada, you're supposed to say Canada, and Labrador, and Newfoundland. And that's the way they want you to pronounce it.
They have a habit of leaving part of a name out of everything they talk about. It's hard. We said we didn't want to go on a foreign language mission, but we did. I knew Norm and Maisie for that year we were on the island, and I didn't understand 5% of what they said, because they left so much out of their language.
Well, anyway, see, I'm already talking too much because I'm back to where President Blake told us, we made the decision about taking the trailer. On one of his calls, he told us that we would be actually between two branches, Corner Brook and Deer Lake. And so there was a place there we could park a trailer if we decided to bring our trailer. He left it up to us. And that would be at, where
We
did
talked
what was
about
that?
it and tried to figure it out. And we came to the decision to take the trailer. That way we had our own equipment and own furniture. If you go there without a trailer, we would have had to have rented an unfinished apartment and then try to scrounge up enough furniture to live. And we didn't want to do that, so we took the trailer.
And where was that little town that he gave us the telephone number and we talked to the campground before we even left? Where did we?
Yeah, Pasadena. Yeah, before we left here, we researched where there was a campground in halfway between those two branches, and so Pasadena was the town there. And so I had a big book that listed all the campgrounds in Canada and US, so we looked it up, found that trailer park, and so we called him and talked to the fellow and made reservations to stay there.
We told him we'd be there a year and a half. He said that would be fine. He'd make arrangements through the winter. However, no one else had ever camped there through the winter, but he would be really happy to try it. So we made those arrangements before we left. And Pasadena is a beautiful little town on a lake. The lake is just beautiful. And the surroundings where the trailer park is has trees and walks and flowers, and it was just a lovely place to camp.
We were right on the edge of the lake. The lake was,
Stop for 2 seconds here and let me switch discs. This only has, it says